Hello, my name is Jaru, and today we're talking about Undertale. Specifically, we're talking about the Undertale lore hidden within a book released this year, called Legends of Localization Book 3. There will be major spoilers for both Undertale and Deltarune, so please play them both before watching this. This book was written by a man named Clyde Mandolin, a professional translator who worked on Undertale's translation from English to Japanese. Why is this important? Well, not only is Mandolin a friend of Toby Fox, but it was actually Toby Fox's idea for Mandolin to make this book in the first place. As a result, Mandolin had, quote, unparalleled access to the behind-the-scenes process involved with the development and translation of Undertale. And thanks to Toby having to give explanations to the translation team about the characters, world, and terminology, this resulted in him revealing some new information about this game's lore, and it is that lore which I will be sharing with you today. However, before I dive in, there are some misconceptions about this book that I need to clear up. When this book was first released, there was a wildfire of rumors on social media about it apparently confirming some popular fan theories. This line in particular, which is part of the book's closing statement, was shared around as being some sort of smoking gun regarding the nature of Frisk, Chara, and the player's relationship. This misconception about what this line was discussing forced Mandolin to release a statement clarifying that this was not meant to be read as lore, and that he would remove this line from future releases of the book. This caused a reverse wildfire to sweep social media, where people now started saying there was no lore in this book, and that it shouldn't be regarded as a source of canon information. These conflicting stories and rumors were so prevalent that I felt obligated to check the book out for myself and dispel these rumors once and for all. And what did I find? Well, to put it simply, yes, there is new lore about the world of Undertale in this book. Most of it is very minor and doesn't change much, but there are some juicier bits that are worth dissecting. However, since there has been so much misinformation spread about this book, I'm going to be aiming for maximum transparency in this video. As such, whenever I'm discussing a piece of lore, I will have a symbol and a page number in the top left corner of the screen. The page number will be a simple citation showing where I got this information from in the book. The symbol, on the other hand, will tell you what kind of source I am referring to. If it is the annoying dog symbol, that means it is a direct quote from Toby Fox. If it is an outline of the annoying dog, that means it is an indirect quote from Toby Fox. In other words, this is when Toby said something and the author is relaying the gist of that sentiment without necessarily quoting Toby Fox word for word. And lastly is the outline of the annoying dog crossed out. This symbol means the lore is stated by the author but doesn't specifically reference Toby Fox in any way. These bits of lore are technically the easiest to dismiss, as they're not straight from the mouth of Toby Fox. However, and I really must emphasize this book was written because Toby Fox suggested it. It had a ton of involvement from Toby Fox, it was written by a man who is a friend of Toby Fox, and this was only eventually printed after Toby Fox read it and gave it the thumbs up. As such, while you can ignore the lore referenced by Mandolin if you like, this book has enough credentials to qualify as a viable source of canon lore in my opinion. With all that said, there's one final detail I need to bring up. The goal of this book is to be educational. It describes the history of Undertale, Toby Fox, and the translation of the game. It primarily focuses on showcasing some of the trials and tribulations the translation team faced when converting the game to Japanese. The fact that Toby Fox revealed lore in the process of explaining the game to these translators is incidental and is not the thing that the writer focuses on. As such, while I did find lore within these pages, it's very much a case of me scraping together a few tiny details. Most of this book is not lore, and that's fine. I actually had a great time reading it, as the way it showcases all the inspirations and references that went into the creation of Undertale was fascinating. I highly recommend checking out this book if you're a die-hard Undertale fan, as this is easily one of the most detailed detailed compendiums describing how Toby Fox went about creating this game. However, since this book is not entirely focused on lore, and because I don't want to undermine the sales of this book, I will not be showing any of the pages on screen. I'll quote it and describe the information provided, but you'll just have to take my word for it that I'm referencing something real. Hopefully, me citing specific page numbers will be enough to earn your confidence. Also, it would probably violate copyright to show a bunch of pages of a book in a YouTube video, so that's another factor I had to consider. And with that, we are ready to begin. If you enjoy this video and would like to see the channel stay up and running, please consider supporting me on Ko-fi or Patreon. Through Ko-fi, you can make one-time donations and work towards fun donation goals. For example, the video you're currently watching was only made because viewers like you donated the money I needed to buy the book. Alternatively, if you'd like to get sneak peeks of my videos and support the channel more consistently, consider supporting me on Patreon. Both of these options go a long way towards keeping this channel up and running, and they really help bring financial stability to my life. With all that said, here is every bit of notable lore within Legends of Localization Book 3, Undertale. The first detail I thought y'all might find interesting is this line discussing Frisk's gender. Mandolin mentions that Japanese fan translations often mistakenly gendered Frisk as a boy, whereas the source material leaves their gender, quote, unstated. The fact that Mandolin refers to Frisk's gender as unstated rather than non-binary could be read as Toby Fox wanting Frisk's gender identity to be wholly left up to fan interpretation. Next is our first noteworthy Toby Fox quote, in which he says, MTT loves English, MTT being Mettaton in this context. The fact that Toby specifies Mettaton prefers English over other human languages not only suggests that English exists in this universe, but that Japanese may exist as well. This was already somewhat implied by anime existing, but this definitely adds more evidence to the idea that Undertale takes place on some version of Earth. On the same page is a quote about Ice-E, in which Toby describes him as, quote, one of those insufferable knockoff mascots. This fairly strongly suggests that Ice-E isn't just a knockoff of a real-life mascot, but may actually be a knockoff within the world of Undertale. Notably, the word search is the only place we see Ice-E until we get to Deltarune, and the word search itself is heavily implied to be created by this monster in the library. This is implied because not only is the word search targeted at monsters rather than humans, but it also features terms that specifically reference the first few bosses found in the underground. It also features the word cigar, which is quite inappropriate for a human word search, but for a knockoff word search created by a monster who smokes cigars, it makes a lot more sense. Toby Fox even specifically mentions that the creator of the word search loves cigars and smokes them all the time. But what's even more fascinating is that this suggests Ice-E is a character created by a monster in the underground rather than one created by humans. And him being described as a knockoff could be read as the monsters finding human trash in Waterfall that featured cartoon mascots, which then inspired them to create their own mascot. In fact, given the evidence that this takes place on Earth, and the fact that this line from Deltarune seems to be referencing Chuck E. Cheese, it could be that Chuck E. Cheese canonically exists in both of these games, with Ice-E being a knockoff of him specifically. But wait, this goes even deeper. In Undertale, Ice-E appears here and nowhere else, but in Deltarune, the Ice-E brand is huge and everywhere. This would make a ton of sense if Ice-E was created by a monster. In Deltarune, the monsters are thriving, so instead of Ice-E being restricted to a local word search, he has instead exploded into this massive franchise. This also explains why there's so much Ice-E merchandise in the hometown, as it may very well be the largest corporation ever created by a monster in this reality. And all of this deduction is made possible thanks to this one throwaway quote from Toby Fox. You see now why the lore in this book was absolutely worth investigating. fascinating. Although, to be clear, this was mostly me theorizing rather than anything concrete. But the core quote is still canon and is still very interesting. Next up, when describing the flashback of the fallen child climbing the mountain, Mandolin describes it as follows. Much later, a lone human climbs the mountain and accidentally falls into the monster's underground world. This implies that the fallen child, aka Chara, fell into the underground by accident, rather than them jumping down intentionally. This was always implied by the intro, as we are shown Chara tripping on a vine. However, it has become a popular headcanon in the community to imagine that Chara climbed the mountain as part of some attempt at ending their own life. Whether that was their intention or not, and whether they were suicidal or not, the evidence does seem to suggest that them falling into the underground was not something they intended to do. The next detail that caught my eye was that Mount Ebott is Toby's name backwards with some minor alterations. This is in reference to how the mountain in Earthbound was named after that game's creator. This isn't technically lore, but I mention it so that nobody goes on a goose chase trying to find the secret meaning of this mountain's name. That's the sort of time wasting that I myself am quite vulnerable to. Continuing with his description of the intro, Mandolin says, after falling down a hole on Mount Ebott, the main character wakes up near some strange underground ruins. The use of the word falling rather than jumping seems to suggest that Frisk, much like Chara, also came to the underground by accident. Furthermore, the phrasing of wakes up suggests that Frisk is still alive. This may seem obvious, but some folks theorize that Frisk is a walking corpse possessed by Chara, or that Frisk is literally Chara, so any descriptors that imply Frisk is alive is useful when considering such theories. Another notable detail is that Earthbound has its own underground world that the characters visit at one point, called the Lost Underworld. This was likely one of the inspirations for Toby Fox's various underground locations. At one point, Mandolin asked Toby Fox if Undertale takes place within the Lost Underworld from Earthbound. Toby just responded with LOL. It seems Toby is not too keen on the idea of Undertale being viewed as some sort of unofficial Earthbound sequel. When discussing Flowey, Mandolin says Flowey uses the Japanese personal pronoun boku, which gives off a friendly, boyish vibe. Even after revealing his cruel, sinister side and switches to a rude Japanese speaking style, he continues to use the lighthearted boku pronoun. This early localization choice makes sense after the players learn Flowey's true identity much later on. This is interesting because even though Flowey has likely existed for years or possibly decades thanks to the use of his saving and loading, he still views himself as a young boy. This could suggest that the trauma he experienced has stunted his mental and emotional growth, causing him to remain stuck in an immature, boyish persona. This is an aspect of his character that only gets highlighted here thanks to the nature of the Japanese personal pronoun system, and since Toby Fox gave the okay on this change, that makes this a canonical reflection of Flowey's character. We'll see a fair few more of these sorts of revelations as we continue on. When discussing the friendliness pellets that Flowey attacks you with, Mandolin makes note, saying, incidentally, the term friendliness pellets was localized as friendliness capsules after much internal discussion. This is one of those details that feels significant, but for the life of me, I can't tell you how. Maybe these pellets are more akin to pill capsules than they are to flower seeds? I'm not sure. Next, Toby mentions in his translation notes that the name Ruins is a reference to the game Brandish. Now, most of these references to other games I won't be bringing up, as this video is about Undertale lore and not about cheeky nods to other franchises. However, in this case, I thought I'd mention it, as Brandish is something Toby has brought up before. In the Deltarune Fangamer playthrough of Chapter 1, Toby mentioned that the scene of Susie and Chris falling into the Dark World was also a reference to Brandish. Toby then immediately steered the conversation away from Brandish, implying that he didn't want to discuss it further. I bring this all up to suggest that, much like we investigated Earthbound, perhaps we theorists should take a look at Brandish when trying to decipher the inspirations and ideas present in Toby Fox's work. Perhaps he tried to avoid discussing Brandish because it might spoil some of his future plans for Deltarune. Next up, Frisk starts the game wearing a bandage, and Mandolin points out how, in English, a bandage could be seen as referring to either an adhesive bandage, like a band-aid, or a bandage wrap, like those seen in hospitals. He then states that this ambiguity was intentional, which implies that Toby Fox wanted to leave some of Frisk's backstory up to interpretation. This is a recurring trend throughout this book, with Toby wanting to leave ambiguity about a variety of topics. However, when translated to Japanese, this bandage ambiguity could not be maintained, and so Toby had to pick one definition or the other to describe Frisk's bandage. In the end, he went with bandage wrap, implying that Frisk was recently injured in a sufficiently severe way to require intensive medical treatment and bandaging. When discussing the idea of a monster being fallen down, Toby noted that this term was a partially cut concept for describing the state someone enters just before death. This is interesting, as the idea of something being partially cut suggests that it was removed from the game in one way but was maintained in another. Since the concept of fallen down is still discussed in-game, I can only assume that Toby originally intended for this to be a mechanic within battle, with your opponent entering the fallen down state right before you killed them. Presumably, he cut this from the fights themselves because it would slow down combat too much, but he preserved the concept in the lore because it was integral to the Alphys storyline. Next is a lengthy section in which Toby himself describes the concept of determination within Undertale. I won't quote the whole thing here, as it's really quite lengthy, and it's mostly spent discussing Toby's ideas for how to translate it. That said, I will share the bits that are relevant to the lore. Quote, meaning of the word determination as most commonly used in the game. Resolve to continue. Will to live. Refusal to give up/die. Appears to be related to fighting spirit in some cases. Determination also turns out to be Alphys' code word for an actual physical substance that she injects into monsters, one that humans produce naturally in large quantities. This substance has the following properties. Creatures with too much are unable to die, D-termination. The being with the most determination in the underground has the power to change fate and use the in-game save/load system. There's a lot to unpack here. Firstly, this brings attention to how the psychological concept of determination is separate from the actual substance within human bodies. These psychological and physical concepts do overlap heavily, but one may not necessarily require the other. This is reflected in the amalgamates, who have a great deal of the determination substance, but do not have much in the way of psychological determination. The second notable detail is the way that the substance of determination grants two powers, the inability to die and access to the save load system. This distinction between the two powers is noteworthy, as it suggests that even if you don't have the most determination in the underground, you may still be unkillable provided you have enough of it. This is a fact we see showcased in the final battle against Asriel, as even though we no longer have access to the save load system, he is still unable to kill us. The third detail of note is the way Toby specifies how having the most determination in the underground is what grants you access to saving and loading. This might mean nothing, as it could simply be him acknowledging that the whole game takes place underground, but it could also mean that saving and loading are mechanics specifically tied to the underground, with humans on the surface being unable to use this power. Alternatively, it may imply that saving and loading exists on the surface, but that the surface save system and the underground save system are separate from each other, similar to how the light world and dark world are separate in Deltarune. The idea that saving and loading are tied to some special property only present in the underground is a theory that has existed in the community for some time. I've never personally liked it, as I feel it undermines the strength of Frisk as a character, but I still feel obligated to report on this detail, regardless of whether I like its implications. And unfortunately, this undermining of Frisk's power and agency only becomes more prevalent later in this book. Side note, the Japanese term ketsui is used to describe determination in Undertale, specifically the katakana version of the word, and when Queen describes determination in Deltarune, she uses the exact same term. If this version of determination was different from the Undertale version, using a different yet similar Japanese term for it would have been a great way to showcase that difference. But since Toby used the same term here, that suggests he wants us to view Deltarune's determination and Undertale's determination as being one and the same. Whether this is a trick on Toby's part is yet to be seen. Next is another piece of anti-lore, with Toby confirming that the description of this dummy is a, quote, meaningless poem. Rest in peace to all the fans out there desperately trying to characterize this unknown ghost character. Upon reaching the Napstablook encounter, Mandolin describes the process involved with the depiction of Napstablook's gender. Quote, because the English script refers to Napstablook as them rather than him or her, the localization team kept Napstablook's gender unstated and unclear as much as possible in the Japanese script. Once again, we see the term unstated being used in reference to a character's gender. This could add further credence to the idea that Toby wanted certain characters' genders to be left open to fan interpretation. The description of Vegetoid says they are, quote, not monitored by the USDA. This is, of course, a joke referencing the United States Department of Agriculture, but given the other evidence of this game taking place on Earth, you could read this as a canonical reference to the United States. Naturally, they had to change this line when translating, as Japanese fans would not know what the USDA is. But more importantly, Mandolin specifically asked Toby if this USDA line was a reference to an in-universe United States. Toby's response was, quote, USDA could be Underground Salad Demon Association. The use of the phrase could be is yet another instance of Toby preferring to leave certain details up to fan interpretation. Presumably, he wants Undertale to feel like it could take place anywhere, and not limit it to the USA. However, given that this joke relies on players and the in-universe narrator knowing what the USDA is, I'd still consider this further evidence for the theory that this game takes place on Earth. Speaking of elements designed to be ambiguous, let's talk about Papyrus and Sans. These two are simply described as brothers in the English script, with it being left unclear who was the older brother and who was the younger. Mandolin notes that this ambiguity was yet another instance of Toby wanting the nature of their relationship to be left unclear. However, Japanese does not have a neutral term for brothers. They have to refer to each other as either younger brother or older brother. As a result, after consulting with Toby Fox, the translators were definitively informed that Sans is the older brother and Papyrus is the younger. Next is with regards to Papyrus's battle body. Toby noted to the translators that this term was a direct reference to Sigma from Mega Man X3, who refers to this form as his ultimate battle body. However, and this is the noteworthy part, Mandolin clarifies that while the term is a reference to Sigma, the actual design of Papyrus's outfit is not. This suggests that there is an actual in-universe reason for Papyrus dressing like this that has yet to be revealed. The fact that Papyrus has yet to explain the inspiration for his battle body, even in the recent Q&A, could imply that the origin of this outfit will be revealed later on in Deltarune. The term dust has significance in Undertale, as it's what monsters turn into after dying. However, there are multiple words for dust in Japanese, each with its own connotations. As a result, they had to be more specific with the nature of monster dust when describing it in the translation. They settled on calling it chiri, which describes dust that floats in the air and lightly covers things. This is noteworthy as it helps us distinguish regular dust from dust with a more sinister connotation. For example, these dust bunny enemies are made of dust in Deltarune, so depending on the term used, they could be viewed in a disturbing light. Thankfully, since they are described with the term watabokori, which refers to lumps of cotton-like dust, we know they're likely not made of monster dust. Next is with regards to the wrong number phone call you can receive at this point in Snowdin. This call is quite mysterious, as the caller is attempting to speak to someone whose name starts with G. There are multiple characters whose name starts with the letter G, so this was quite the mystery. However, due to the way Japanese works, translating this line directly would force the translators to reveal the next letter in this person's name, which would reveal their identity and spoil the mystery. To prevent get this, Toby instructed the translators to keep this line in English. While this certainly keeps us from confirming that the caller is talking about Gaster, there is still some information we can gather from this phone call. For one, by keeping this line in English even in the Japanese script, that adds further credence to the idea that English and Japanese are both real languages in the world of Undertale. Then there's the matter of the wrong number song that the caller sings. This song is already quite silly, but it gets even sillier in Japanese. Mandolin reveals that the Japanese version has the character saying the equivalent of Sawi in their version of the song, which is absurdly childish and goofy. What implications this has for the identity of the person calling is a matter of opinion, but it was interesting enough that I felt justified including it. There is one other phone-related translation worth noting. The player has a chance to receive a prank phone call from Sans at this point in the game. The English script technically leaves it ambiguous regarding who is calling, but in the Japanese version, he blatantly identifies himself as Sans. The reason I bring it up is because this is a pretty rare event in Undertale, and it has some potential implications. Namely, it implies that Sans has our phone number, even though we never gave it to him. This implies that either Sans is calling random numbers in the underground, Sans thinks he's calling Toriel, or Sans somehow acquired our phone number. Y'all let me know which one of these you think is the most likely. Next is another gender-related translation, this time for Monster Kid. Once again, Mandolin refers to their gender as, quote, never specified, and as them having, quote, no clear gender. He also again emphasizes that this was by design on Toby Fox's part. However, in Japanese, Monster Kid does refer to themselves with the masculine ore pronoun, which is a crude term used by tough guys in fiction. That said, it can technically be used by girls, so it's not firmly confirming anything beyond how Monster Kid views themselves. This is quite relieving to me, as I always read Monster Kid as a rebellious punk, so I'm glad my reading comprehension was on point. Next is Onionsan, who is also meant to have an unclear gender in Undertale. However, unlike Monster Kid, Onionsan uses the pronoun watashi, which is considered a somewhat gender-neutral and impersonal pronoun. It gives the impression that Onionsan is trying to be polite, but is so awkward that it comes across somewhat strangely. They also sometimes forego a pronoun altogether, instead referring to themselves by their own name, which is considered odd and somewhat childish in Japanese. That said, watashi is only somewhat gender neutral. It is considered neutral in professional environments, such as when giving a speech or at work, but when talking with friends or family, watashi takes on a slightly more feminine connotation. Whether this is by design for Onionsan is a matter of opinion. Next is the matter of Temmie gender. Almost all Temmies simply refer to themselves by their own name, again implying a strange, primitive, or otherwise childish energy. But when they do refer to themselves with personal pronouns, they use the feminine achishi. Appropriately, achishi is not only an uncommon pronoun to use nowadays, but it's also typically associated with energetic feminine characters. However, there is one exception to this among the Temmies. Bob is a Temmie who speaks completely normally, has a name that is traditionally masculine, and in Japanese he refers to himself with the boku pronoun. Boku is associated with young boys like Ness from Earthbound. It is also used by Flowey, although it comes across as creepy and unsettling in his case. This could still mean that Bob is biologically female and simply identifies as a boy, but Toby actually has a direct quote on this topic later on. Quote, Temmies are generally all girls, besides Bob, I think. Next is a rather minor bit of lore, but Toby actually gives a pronunciation guide for Alphys' name. He says it should be pronounced Alphys. I may or may not have pronounced it correctly throughout this video. Next up on the gender chopping block is Mettaton, who refers to himself with the boku pronoun. This may seem strange, as we just established that boku is used for young boys, not grown men, but there is a reason for it. While somewhat uncommon, grown men can use boku when trying to give off a good-natured, humble, or friendly vibe. Given that Mettaton is effectively a pretty boy rock star, it makes sense that he'd present himself in this way. Although, you could spin this in a more Flowey-like direction direction if you wanted. Mettaton is trying to kill you throughout the game, so him using Boku could be read as unsettling. After all, it's the equivalent of someone politely informing you that they're going to kill you. Alternatively, you could argue that Mettaton as a ghost is somewhat stunted emotionally and is stuck viewing himself as a young boy even though he's likely quite old. Needless to say, there's a lot of potential subtlety and subtext that can be found in the Japanese language. All that said, Mettaton does switch to a different pronoun at one point. When dressed up as a princess, he refers to himself with watashi. This is a great example of how watashi can take on a more feminine tone in certain contexts. Next is the iconic scene where Sans informs us that we'd be dead if he hadn't made that promise to Toriel. While the translation of this line isn't particularly noteworthy, Mandolin's comments on the line are. He emphasizes how this line is written in a very ambiguous way, with it being left unclear why the main character would be dead. The options for how this line could be read, as brought up by Mandolin, are Sans would have killed the player himself, Sans would have captured the player for the king to kill later on, or possibly something else entirely. I found this insistence on the vagueness of this line to be fascinating, as I never thought of this line as particularly vague before now. I always thought of it as Sans saying that he would have killed Frisk had he not made his promise to Toriel, but apparently it's meant to be viewed in a more vague light than I thought. It's an interesting clarification that I thought was worth pointing out. Next is an interesting quote from Toby Fox about Asgore. When describing him, he says, "King," but his method of speech is kind of like goofy, forgetful dad, with only certain points that he goes into cold, distant / formal king. He's not really great at being a king. Most of this is unremarkable, as that characterization is mostly pretty clear in the English script. But what surprised me was Toby's comment that Asgore is not very good at being a king. I always considered Asgore to be a highly admirable figure who did a better job as king than anybody could have asked for. Pretty much all of the neutral endings show that everyone not named Toriel is worse at being king than Asgore. Obviously he made mistakes and did bad things, but nothing he does is even remotely as evil, incompetent, or irrational as most real-life kings were. The fact that Toby views Asgore as being bad at his job is a surprising reveal. I suppose it's hard to be considered good at your job when you've killed a bunch of kids, especially in the eyes of a pacifist like Toby. He could also be saying that Asgore is simply too nice to be an effective king, rather than him being specifically bad at the job. Either way, it's a fascinating insight into Toby's view of this character. Next up, when picking up this item in a No Mercy playthrough of Undertale, it is referred to as the Locket, with the being capitalized. This is different from its description in neutral and pacifist routes, as it's meant to emphasize that this locket holds greater significance to the fallen child than it does to Frisk. This subtext had to be spelled out a little more clearly in the Japanese version though, as things like uppercase letters and articles such as the don't exist in said language. As such, the Japanese version of this line translates to took back a/the locket. This emphasis on took back makes it extra clear that this locket once belonged to the fallen child, aka Chara. Next, we have another piece of anti-lore. Have you ever wondered why lemon bread is called lemon bread? Well, don't. It's just a reference to Gunstar Heroes, in which the English version of the game has a goofily named enemy called Melon Bread. Once again, I feel bad for anyone who spent hours contemplating the significance of lemon bread in the Undertale lore. The DT machine is a spooky piece of equipment in the secret lab. The implication is that this machine extracts determination from human souls, with the letters DT being short for determination. However, this was never confirmed until now. In the Japanese script, determination is represented with the word ketsui, and thus the DT machine is called the KTI machine. This is in reference to the three symbols that make up the word ketsui. Next is Omega Flowey. In this form, Flowey continues to use the Boku pronoun, further showcasing how cemented the idea of being a young boy is in his mind. This is commented on by Mandolin, who points out how characters characters corrupted by overwhelming power often switch to a different personal pronoun in Japanese stories. The fact that Flowey continues to use Boku provides a unique insight into his mental state. Mandolin goes on to confirm another interesting detail about Asriel, specifically that Asriel Dreamer being an anagram of serial murderer was intentional on Toby Fox's part. Notably, the anagram is divided between Asriel, which becomes serial, and Dreamer, which becomes murderer. This seems to paint all of the Dreamers as potential murderers, which makes sense for Asgore and Flowey, although it may or may not make sense for Toriel. Then again, she's never referred to as Dreamer by any of the other characters, and the one time she refers to herself as Dreamer, she asks that you not call her that. Given that she divorces Asgore after he commits to his murderous plan, it could be that discarding his name thematically represents Toriel refusing the idea of becoming a murderer. What connotations this has for the Dreamer family in Deltarune has yet to be seen. Chris is a Dreamer now, so perhaps they too have taken someone's life. Chris is an anagram of risk, so maybe Chris was involved in a risky murder. An interesting possibility, if I do say so myself. A further detail that gets confirmed by Mandolin is that Asriel is not only a combination of the names Asgore and Toriel, but it's also a reference to Asriel, the mythological angel of death. Some monsters in Undertale think the angel from the prophecy is an angel of death, which seems to imply that Asriel is the angel from the prophecy in at least one of the game's endings. Next up is the term goner. This word is interesting, as it seems to refer to these strange monochrome entities all tied up with Gaster. However, it also refers to Asriel's ultimate attack, the Hyper Goner. This attack is supposedly powerful enough to wipe out the entire timeline, so the fact that it resembles a fusion of the DT machine and Asriel's own skull seems rather significant. Flowey also takes a DT machine-like form as Omega Flowey, which makes sense given how integral this machine was in bringing Flowey to life. This weave of references surrounding the concept of goners only gets deeper as we learn the origins of the Hyper Goner, and more importantly, what it translated from in Japanese. Toby got the term Hyper Goner from the ultimate attack used by the final boss in Final Fantasy VI. This attack was called Goner in the English version. Now, normally we dissociate this term with someone who is doomed to die, but that's not quite an accurate depiction of the original name of this attack. In Japanese, this attack was not called Goner, and was instead called something closer to missing. As a result, the Undertale translators maintained this reference by translating Asriel's attack into hyper missing. The reason this is all so noteworthy is because it makes a lot more sense to describe these monochrome entities as missing than it does to describe them as doomed to die. These goner entities seem to exist outside of our regular reality, and Goner Kid specifically describes what it would be like if you went missing and yet nothing changed. In effect, goners are goners not just because they are cursed or doomed in some way, but because they are literally gone from this reality. Just as Asriel's Hyper Goner ensures that the whole timeline goes missing. This was all quite the intriguing revelation to discover, as you can imagine. The double meanings continue in Asriel's final battle. If you die while fighting Asriel, your soul starts to shatter, but then it recombines while saying, "but it refused" on screen. Much like how determination has a double meaning, this line also has two readings. The first interpretation is the standard version, where the protagonist is so determined that they refuse to die. The second reading is the wordplay, where the soul literally essentially refuses back together. Normally, the word refuse means to deny, but in this context, it also means to combine back together. Unfortunately, this double meaning couldn't be effectively translated into Japanese. Instead, they provided us with something even more interesting. In Japanese, the narration takes on a first-person perspective. Instead of saying, "but it refused," it now says, "No, I won't be broken." This is a fascinating change, as not only does this suggest that Frisk themselves is talking, but also that they are determined enough to refuse their own soul back together. This has to be Frisk talking as well, as the player isn't the one saying this. It could potentially be Chara as well, but I think Frisk makes more sense in this context. I definitely prefer it be Frisk, as this is a rare bit of insight into Frisk as a character that also depicts them in a pretty awesome light. Sadly, the next bit of lore is less positive in its depiction of Frisk. Mandolin describes how the meta concept of reaching your save file was handled in Japanese, and he starts by describing the scene in this way. Quote, "It's revealed that whoever has the most determination in the underground is able to use the in-game save menu functions. In other words, the most determined person in the underground can freely load and save their progress. This is what allows the player to save and load their progress just like in any other game. Except here, it's the actual physical player's determination that enables this ability. The main character is just along for the ride." It saddens me greatly to read this, as it effectively confirms that Frisk was really nothing special. They are only able to save and load because they're being controlled by the player. They may care about these monsters, and they may even have some small amount of determination on their own, as we saw with the Japanese game over screen. But for the purposes of this narrative, saving and loading is a power that Frisk would not possess naturally without our help. That sucks for me, as I much preferred to imagine Frisk as a strong, determined character rather than as a puppet who's just along for the ride. Sadly, it seems that just isn't the narrative Toby was going for. And no matter how much I dislike it, this information does have lore ramifications. Namely, Chris in Deltarune also has a save file, yet they have no playtime on their file when we discover it. If Frisk could not save on their own, then maybe Chris is also unable to save without our help, hence the lack of playtime. It may be that only the player with all our real-life determination is capable of enabling the power to save and load. In fact, this may imply that a single person, no matter how determined, is simply too weak to use this power. Only Flowey, who has the determination of several humans pumped into his body, and Frisk, who has the help of the player, have demonstrated this ability. This works well for furthering the theme of friendship, as Frisk can only defeat Asriel with the help of all the friends that they've made, but it does so at the cost of undermining the strength of the individual characters. This also somewhat undermines the fan theory that all of the previous humans who fell into the underground could also save and load. I personally never liked the idea of every random human having this power, so any evidence against that theory is fine by me. If Frisk could not save on their own, then I highly doubt these other random kids could pull it off. Either way, this is probably the most significant lore we've seen in this book, which makes it appropriate to be the last bit of lore that I will be discussing today. There is this line from the book's closing statement, which was the line shared around on social media, but it really doesn't say anything. It's just pointing out that Chara exists and is vying for control of Frisk's body in at least one of the game's endings. This is not new information. It's just a vaguely poetic way for Mandolin to describe the game before segueing into his final thoughts on Undertale's translation. It's not really worth discussing as lore. Just thought I'd clear that up. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. I do hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Legends of Localization. It really was a fun read, and I only discussed a tiny fraction of its content. Most of it had to be skipped as it wasn't relevant to today's topic. It discusses the Japanese language, the translation process, and the hordes of references and jokes hidden throughout Undertale. As such, if you can spare $50, I'd recommend checking this book out. And before I sign out, I'd just like to give my sincere thanks to Toby Fox and Clyde Mandolin for making this book a reality. And I'm not just saying that for the lore. Documenting and recording an aspect of game design that is often overlooked is a noble endeavor, and it's one whose praises likely go unsung by the majority of the gaming community. And yet, you did it anyway, taking a crucial step in the preservation of video game history. I'm very happy to see this sort of historical recording being done, and I sincerely hope you continue to make such books in the future. Thank you very much for your work. My sincere thanks go to my patrons for helping keep this channel afloat. A special shout out goes to E-Roll, Hannah Brown, Stephanie Klein, Suit Number 1, Aspen Frost, and Leo Dragon Tamer. An extra special shout out goes to Captain APAC and Super CKX7 for supporting me on the Ralsei tier. And finally, a huge shout out goes to Riff6 and Maliki for being the only big shots willing and able to support me on the Spampton tier. You are all instrumental in keeping me and this channel afloat, and I will always be sincerely grateful for your support. Thank you very, very much. And with that, it's about time that I signed off. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.